You are dragged through a doorway so heavy that the iron hinges shriek. The men who grip your arms do not speak. Their hands are rough, scarred from holding reins and weapons. You stumble across tiles that gleam with a dull sheen, worn by countless feet before yours. The scent of incense clings in the air, mixed with something sharper, sweat and oil and fear that never leaves this place. Your bare soles burn against the stone, though the chamber itself is cool. Torches press shadows across the walls, making the space flicker alive with shapes that seem to watch you. When they finally release you, you fall forward, knees scraping on the floor polished by knees of others, boys who came before you and never left. You try to look up. You try to see who waits. The guards press your head down until your cheek rests against the stone. You taste dust, bitter and cold, and hear your own pulse thrumming in your ears. Voices rise. They are not in your language. Harsh syllables collide, rolling through the chamber like thunder. You hear the name of a city you once knew, the city your family was forced to leave when riders came. You hear the word tribute. You hear the word boy. When they make you kneel upright again, you see them. Men seated on cushions higher than your head. Silk robes spill around them, gleaming in torchlight. Gold threads shimmer when they shift, and the jewels at their belts glitter like cold stars. Their faces are stern, eyes narrowed, unmoving. You are measured as if you were livestock, not human. One speaks, and the others nod. A decision has been made. A hand reaches toward you. Fingers brush against your chin, turning your face side to side. Your jaw is lifted, your teeth shown, your eyes inspected for brightness. The hand smells of musk and smoke, the skin soft, unused to labor. You shiver. You wish to pull away, but you do not dare. Your thin tunic is tugged at, pulled open, and laughter murmurs when the hollowness of your chest and ribs is revealed. You flush with shame, though no one offers pity. They see only what they want, not what you are. Behind you, the guards wait. They know what happens next. They have seen it many times. The first touch is never the last. You are taken deeper into corridors that narrow, walls closing in as the torches grow fewer. The silence thickens. A door shuts behind you, sealing you inside a world from which there is no return. You are not asked your name. It does not matter. Here you are not a son, not a brother, not even a captive. Here you are a possession, a concubine of the Mongol lords in Persia. But before we continue, if you enjoy dark and forgotten history, consider subscribing and comment where you are watching from. It helps us a lot to make more videos like this. Now, back to the video. In the 14th century, the Mongol Ilkhanate ruled Persia. It was an empire born of conquest, a branch of the great Mongol world order that stretched from the steppes of Mongolia to the heart of the Middle East. When Hulagu, grandson of Genghis Khan, carved his dominion from the ruins of the Abbasid Caliphate, he set into motion a system that blended Mongol military dominance with Persian administration, religion, and custom. By the time the Ilkhanate reached its height, its court mirrored both the steppe traditions of the conquerors and the elaborate etiquette of Persian kingship. Power in this world was measured not only by cavalry and coin, but also by possession. The Ilkhanid elite displayed their supremacy through palaces, silks, horses, and servants. Among these servants were the most intimate of captives, foreign boys taken as tribute from conquered lands. Tribute was not only a payment of gold, livestock, or grain. It was also human. Christian communities from Georgia and Armenia, and Muslim populations from Anatolia or Central Asia, were compelled to send their sons into the households of the Mongol rulers. Some were made pages, attendants in stables or kitchens. Others were absorbed into a more hidden world, one of concubinage. Concubinage was a practice inherited from both Mongol traditions and the Islamic courts they now ruled over. The Abbasids, like the Byzantines before them, had long employed eunuchs, slaves, and concubines as signs of wealth and power. For the Mongols, who measured loyalty in blood and submission, these boys became both trophies and tools. They were forced into roles that blurred the line between servant and property, child and object. The Ilkhanid court in Tabriz was a place of magnificence, described by travelers like Marco Polo and Rashid al-Din. Silk draped the walls, tiled halls echoed with music, and gardens bloomed with fountains. Yet behind this splendor was another reality. The wealth of the empire rested on systems of extraction and domination. Gold and grain from the provinces, captives and tributes from the frontiers, all fed into the court's hunger. Boys carried from villages hundreds of miles away became tokens of submission, their very bodies absorbed into the machinery of power. In Persian chronicles, their presence is rarely recorded. They exist as shadows between the lines, unnamed and faceless. When mentioned at all, they are grouped under words like servants or pages, categories that conceal the truth of their exploitation. Yet the silence speaks volumes. The absence of their voices reveals how complete their erasure was. The Ilkhanid dynasty itself was fragile, often torn between conversion to Islam and attachment to Mongol customs. But whether a ruler followed the old shamans, adopted Christianity, or embraced Islam, the practice of taking boys into concubinage did not falter. It was woven into the logic of empire, into the quiet calculations of tribute and loyalty. To refuse was to rebel, to give was to survive. Behind the grand palaces and the chronicles of rulers, this shadow economy of flesh endured. A boy of 12 is taken from the mountains of Armenia. His village is told to provide tribute or face destruction. His father bargains with the soldiers, offering livestock instead, but the riders insist. They want sons, not sheep. The boy is chosen because his face is unmarked and his limbs are slender. His mother wails, tearing her hair, but she cannot stop them. Bound to a mule, he begins the long journey toward Tabriz. In the camp he is washed. Not in kindness, but in preparation. Rough hands strip away his clothes, scrub his skin until it burns, and cut his hair close. He shivers in silence, the water too cold, the air too heavy with smoke. At night he lies among other captives. They whisper in different tongues, prayers in Armenian, Georgian, Turkic, and Persian, none of which bring comfort. The soldiers mock them, telling them they are lucky, that they will serve lords instead of dying in the fields. But the boys do not feel lucky. They feel hollow. When he arrives at the palace, the scale of it overwhelms him. Domes gleam under the sun, courtyards stretch wider than his entire village, and fountains sparkle with water he cannot drink. He is led not to the public halls, but to the private quarters, where the air smells of perfume and musk. His body is examined again, weighed not in strength, but in beauty. He lowers his eyes, too afraid to meet the gaze of those who look at him as if he were an object. His duties are explained in fragments of broken Armenian and Persian. He must wait silently, fetch wine, pour water, stand by the doorway when summoned. But beneath these tasks lies the unspoken command. At night he is sent to a chamber where cushions line the floor and lamps glow faintly. Here he is no longer a boy from the mountains. He is no longer anyone at all. He is used, and when it is over, he is dismissed without a word. Another victim, a boy from Georgia, shares his fate. They sometimes pass each other in corridors, their eyes meeting briefly before looking away. Neither dares to speak. Guards watch them constantly, and punishment for defiance is swift. The Georgian boy once muttered a prayer too loudly, and his cheek was struck until it bled. The scar remains, a mark of silence. Over time, the Armenian boy learns to obey without question. His back straightens, his face hardens, but inside he still remembers the scent of pine from his village, the sound of his mother's voice calling him home. In the palace, those memories fade like smoke. He is told he belongs here now, that he is fortunate to serve. Yet in his heart he knows he has been stolen. History does not record his name. His story is not written in chronicles. But his life was real, and it was consumed by the machinery of empire. The Ilkhanid court did not view these boys as individuals. They were units within a broader system, a system that stretched across provinces and frontiers. Tribute was not improvised. It was calculated, demanded through decrees, and enforced by men who carried the authority of the Khan. Local rulers, whether Armenian princes or Persian governors, were expected to provide both wealth and flesh. To resist was to risk devastation. To comply was to preserve fragile survival. The empire was vast but fragile, dependent on constant displays of submission. Concubinage became one of these displays. A household filled with foreign boys was proof of dominance, a visible sign that distant communities acknowledged Mongol supremacy. Each boy was both a servant and a message a living emblem of conquest. The Ilkhanid elite absorbed practices from the Islamic courts they supplanted. The Abbasids had long normalized slavery, particularly of young men who served as attendants, singers, and concubines. The Mongols adapted this system with their own traditions of capturing dependents and distributing them among the ruling class. In Ilkhanid Persia, these two legacies merged, creating a structure where exploitation was routine, codified, and accepted. Within the palaces, order was strict. Eunuchs, often castrated captives themselves, managed the inner quarters. They enforced discipline, guarded the boys, and ensured obedience. Punishment for disobedience could be brutal. A boy caught attempting escape might be beaten publicly, not to kill but to terrify others. Whispers of those who vanished entirely circulated in hushed tones, but no one dared to ask where they went. Economically, the practice was sustained by the empire's tributary networks. Just as herds of horses were levied to feed armies, boys were levied to feed courts. The logic was transactional. A governor who delivered a quota of captives avoided heavier taxation or military intervention. Communities calculated losses, deciding which sons to surrender to protect the rest. In this way, entire villages became complicit, not from desire, but from desperation. The empire's chroniclers rarely questioned this arrangement. Rashid al-Din, the vizier whose histories detailed Mongol conquests, recorded campaigns and treaties in precise detail. Yet when it came to the lives of captives, his pages grew vague. The silence was not ignorance, it was acceptance. The system was so ingrained that to question it was unthinkable. Even religion did not halt the machinery. When Ilkhan rulers converted to Islam in the later 14th century, they embraced its legal justifications for concubinage. Christian communities who sent their sons still suffered, though their priests prayed for mercy. The words of scripture were bent to sanction what power demanded. The system was efficient, normalized, and invisible to those who benefited from it. To the rulers, it was not cruelty. It was tribute. It was order. It was empire. The system did not end with one generation. Once tribute was demanded, it became tradition. Governors who sent boys to the Ilkhanid court taught their successors to do the same. Communities that surrendered children to survive once were expected to surrender again. Tribute, once extracted, was never forgotten. It became a rhythm, a cycle of loss repeated across decades. For the boys themselves, the cycle was personal. A child taken into concubinage would grow into adulthood within the palace walls. Some withered early, discarded once their youth faded. Others adapted, learning the languages of the court, serving as attendants or entertainers, and in rare cases rising to positions of influence. A handful of former concubines became trusted advisors or household managers. Yet even their rise reinforced the cycle, for their presence showed younger boys that survival required submission. Those who endured became proof that obedience was rewarded. The eunuchs, many of whom had once been captives themselves, enforced the system with cold precision. Their loyalty to the household was absolute, and their authority over the boys was unquestioned. They carried out punishments, silenced complaints, and reminded each child that escape was impossible. In this way, the cycle turned inward. Victims became guardians of the very structure that had broken them. On the frontier, the cycle was equally relentless. When Mongol envoys arrived, demanding tribute, local leaders rarely resisted. They had seen what happened to villages that refused. Raids left fields burned, livestock stolen, and families scattered. It was better, they believed, to surrender sons than to see entire communities destroyed. And so parents handed over children, consoling themselves with faint hopes that at least the boys would live, even if far from home. Over time, the memory of loss itself became part of the cycle. Mothers told stories of brothers taken before. Fathers whispered warnings that tribute would come again. Children grew up knowing that at any moment, a knock at the door could claim them. Fear became inheritance, passed down like land or tools. The trauma did not vanish. It embedded itself in the rhythm of life. The empire depended on this rhythm. Tribute was not a single act of conquest, but a continuous harvest. Every boy taken reinforced the empire's dominance. Every parent's surrender proved submission. The Ilkhanid rulers did not need to keep conquering new lands so long as their subjects kept supplying captives. Conquest had become routine, conquest repeated through the bodies of children. This was how the Mongol Ilkhanate sustained its power. Not only through armies on horseback or fortresses of stone, but through cycles of human tribute that fed its palaces. What began as an act of conquest became tradition, and tradition became law. And for the boys within those walls, there was no ending, only repetition. The practice left scars deeper than the stones of palaces or the pages of chronicles. The boys taken into concubinage vanished from their homelands, yet their absence reshaped the families and communities left behind. Villages hollowed by tribute learned to expect that sons might not reach adulthood at home. Fathers grew old without heirs. Mothers carried grief that never faded. Entire lineages thinned, not from disease or famine, but from the steady hand of empire reaching into the cradle. For the boys themselves, survival rarely meant freedom. Those who aged out of concubinage carried silence with them. If they remained in service, they became part of the machinery that had consumed them, ensuring its continuation for others. If they were dismissed, they were marked by their years in the palace, alienated from the villages they had once called home. They returned as strangers, bearing a shame they had not chosen. Some never returned at all, disappearing entirely into the records of a foreign empire. The psychological cost cannot be measured, but it can be imagined. Children raised as possessions learned early that their bodies did not belong to them. Obedience became instinct, fear became memory, and shame became identity. In a world where their voices were never written down, silence itself became their legacy. For the Ilkhanate, the system fed into a broader culture of dependency. The reliance on tribute eroded trust between rulers and ruled. Every demand widened the gulf, leaving resentment to fester beneath the surface. When the dynasty fractured in the later 14th century, weakened by internal struggles and external threats, loyalty from subject peoples was scarce. Communities that had surrendered their sons did not weep when the Ilkhanate dissolved. The legacy of forced concubinage was part of the bitterness that outlived the Khans. Yet the practice did not vanish with the Ilkhanate. It lingered, absorbed into successor states and neighboring empires. Concubinage remained normalized, justified by religion, tradition, and the logic of power. The Mongol system was not an anomaly. It was one expression of a broader world in which human beings were reduced to property, their worth measured in obedience and beauty. The consequences are visible not only in the past, but in the way history remembers. The chronicles praise the lords, describe their victories, record their wealth. The boys are barely mentioned, their lives erased even in memory. Their suffering was treated as incidental, unworthy of words. That silence is the sharpest consequence of all. What remains is absence. Absence in villages that lost sons. Absence in chronicles that refused to name them. Absence in history that moved forward as if their lives were expendable. But behind every absence there was a child who lived, who feared, who was consumed. The Ilkhanate is gone. The palaces crumble, the gardens fade, the rulers are forgotten. But the silence of those boys endures, an unbroken echo of what empire chose to erase. The Ilkhanid palaces are ruins now. Their tiled walls cracked, their gardens reclaimed by dust, their fountains dry. Travelers pass through Tabriz and see only fragments of stone, weathered inscriptions, and broken mosaics. Few imagine what those walls once contained. Fewer still remember the boys who lived and died inside them. History records the names of rulers, Abaka, Ghazan, Olyetu. It notes their wars, their conversions, their rivalries. Chroniclers debate whether they favored Islam or clung to Mongol traditions. They measure reigns in treaties and battles. Yet beneath these accounts lies another history, one that was never written. The history of children taken from villages and turned into possessions. The history of silence. The system depended on forgetting. To the rulers, the boys were temporary, their value measured only in the span of their youth. Once that faded, they were dismissed, discarded, or absorbed into roles that left no trace. Their voices never reached the page. Their families never saw them again. Their stories dissolved into air. And yet, traces remain if one looks closely. A letter from a Georgian noble pleading for the return of his son. A chronicle that briefly mentions captives delivered as tribute. a poem that mourns absent children without naming why they were lost. These fragments are scattered, fragile, almost erased. But together, they whisper what the chronicles refuse to say. The consequence of empire was not only conquest, but erasure. The Mongol Ilkhanate built its power on networks of tribute, extraction, and fear. The boys forced into concubinage were part of that network, as essential as taxes or armies. Their suffering was not an accident. It was policy. It was normalized. It was routine. What does it mean when cruelty becomes ordinary? When entire communities expect to lose their sons, not to famine or plague, but to the demands of empire? It means that pain becomes tradition. That silence becomes inheritance. That the machinery of exploitation turns so smoothly that even its victims begin to enforce it. The Ilkhanate collapsed, but the logic endured. Later dynasties in Persia and beyond inherited concubinage, slavery, and the erasure of victims. What began as tribute under Mongol Khans became practice under sultans and shahs. The cycle outlived its creators. Today, when the ruins of Tabriz are studied, they are admired for their architecture and their art. The turquoise tiles, the vast domes, the fragments of carved stone. But beneath that beauty lies the memory of a system that consumed children. A memory hidden not in chronicles, but in absence. You stand among those ruins now, centuries later, the wind carrying dust across silent courtyards. No guards, no torches, no voices remain. Only the echo of footsteps that once belonged to boys who never returned home. You cannot see their faces, but you feel their absence pressing against the stone. That absence is the true legacy of the Ilkhanid court. Not the glory of kings, but the silence of the forgotten. The Mongol Ilkhanate is long gone, its rulers swallowed by time. Yet the silence it left behind lingers. The chronicles that praised their power and recorded their wars rarely spoke of the children who were taken as tribute. To most historians, they remain footnotes at best, shadows at the edge of the record. And perhaps that was the greatest cruelty of all. To be taken, used, and discarded, and then to be forgotten. The system of concubinage in the Ilkhanid court was not an aberration. It was one piece in a global pattern of domination, repeated in empires across centuries. Byzantines, Abbasids, Ottomans, Safavids, all relied on the reduction of human lives into property. The Mongol Ilkhanate absorbed this logic and amplified it, turning tribute into an engine of subjugation. Villages became tributaries of flesh. Parents became unwilling participants in their own loss, and children became symbols of empire's appetite. What does this tell us about power? That its hunger is never sated, that it demands not only gold or land, but the very bodies of the most vulnerable. That cruelty, once institutionalized, ceases to feel cruel to those who enforce it. The Ilkhanid elite may have seen themselves as patrons of art, builders of palaces, and rulers of kingdoms. Yet beneath their silks and domes lay a hidden economy of pain, one that gave them comfort while it erased the lives of others. Centuries later, we cannot recover the names of those boys. But we can reconstruct the outlines of their existence. We can trace the cycle of tribute through fragments of records, through silence itself. We can see how empire thrived on erasure, how power required not only obedience but also forgetfulness. And perhaps that is why their story matters. Because to remember what empire tried to erase is to resist its logic. To name the silence is to give back a fragment of humanity to those who were stripped of it. As you leave the ruins in your mind, picture the courtyards empty now, the halls abandoned, the torches extinguished. Imagine the boys who once walked there, not as servants, not as concubines, but as children who had homes, names, and mothers who waited for them. History did not grant them a voice. But memory can. The Mongol Ilkhanate sought to leave behind monuments of stone and tales of conquest. What it truly left behind was a silence filled with the absence of stolen children, a silence that stretches across centuries, lingering even now. And in that silence, the question remains. Not of what was taken from them, but of what was lost to us when entire generations were consumed by empire. Their names, their stories, their futures, all dissolved. The Ilkhanate is gone, its rulers forgotten, but the silence of those boys endures. It always will.